1, no lube. Check. 2, no kissing. Check.
Welcome to Shat on TV Lovecraft Country, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the new HBO series, Lovecraft Country. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me is my co-host, Ash Lafley.
Hi, y'all.
And this is our deep dive edition where we look back on this week's episode of Lovecraft Country and provide our thoughts and analysis, plus the top listener email and voicemail for the week. This week's episode was episode 6, Meet Me in Daegu. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode. You can do that wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting shatontv.com/subscribe. And don't forget, we have an instant reaction live stream every Sunday night on Twitch. You can find that at shatontv.com/Twitch. And Ash, lots more people have been joining us. I think we hit record numbers for our live stream immediately after the episode airs on Sundays this week, which is pretty exciting. And they gave us a lot of guidance about the topics we're going to be covering in this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been really neat because I think sometimes when you watch a show in isolation and you kind of get into like these pods. So like I feel like you and I are like a little pod now because we watch the show and talk about it together. And it's nice to expand that pod to have additional people in there that maybe loved an episode that we weren't too keen on, or maybe didn't love an episode that we're like, just drooling all over. For example, this episode. And so it's nice to have, just extra perspective. I've really enjoyed that instant reaction with the entire audience, as opposed to just you and B and Big D when he's doing TV with us.
And if you'd like to get involved, there are lots of ways you can do it. Like we mentioned, you can get on with us at Lovecraft Live Sundays immediately after Lovecraft Country airs. You can also email us, host@shatontv.com, or call us and leave a voicemail at 914-719-SHAT. And we're going to get to some of those later in the episode. But Ash, before we get started, what stood out to you the most?
This was the first episode this season that I walked away going, holy shit, that was fucking awesome. Like, I was just really excited. And I think each episode, there's been parts that I've loved like that, but not the entire narrative piece. And so upon rewatches, I kind of groaned through some of it, like having to watch parts of it again, but not this one. I really felt like I was watching almost like a mini film. And I said this on the Instacast that we did on Twitch, but it reminds me a lot of like Westworld's episode of Kiksuya, where it's just kind of this all-inclusive narrative structure that is separate from the general show, but that so deeply informs what is going on in the greater story that's being told. And this felt like that. And I loved it. And just in general, just awesome, good TV. It was emotional. It was scary. It was spooky. It was gross. It was sexy. It was all these things all together. And it's what I've wanted from both Misha Green and our executive producers all season. And this makes me pretty excited about the back half of what we're going to get from Lovecraft Country.
I felt absolutely the same, Ash. It was such a complete episode. I feel like after watching this one episode, I am as familiar with Gia as a character as I am any of the characters that we spent 5 episodes with. For me, the thing that really stood out was how the showrunners seem to really be aware of the fact everyone has Google. Like, they want us to Google this stuff. If you think about any TV show that we've watched, they're going to translate these concepts into something we can understand. So if you were watching a show about a Korean spirit or demon, they would actually call it that. They wouldn't call it a kumiho. They would call it a demon or a spirit, or like Uma would just be mom. They had the concept in this episode of Banmal versus Jandaimal. Different ways of speaking with different degrees of formality. They left that in here in its native tongue. It's a challenge. Like, Lovecraft Country knows we have the internet at our disposal. And I've started to realize that these things that we're dubbing Easter eggs, they're not really Easter eggs. They're more, like you said, Ash, they're a lesson plan for the audience. They're trying to educate us as well as entertain us.
It's kind of been this cultural movement in the US with the introduction of like K-pop and things like that, that I feel like a lot of Americans have really dug into South Korean culture in the past, let's say, decade. It's really been kind of like the cool thing to do, or like the in thing to do. I know a lot of young people, like at the university, they were obsessed with Korean culture. And I think it's kind of cool to flip that on its head, because the whole show so far has been about othering, right? And they make us feel like the other because we don't speak the language potentially, and we don't understand the culture inherently, and it's in a different time period, and it's a different storyline than the one that we're used to. So we as the audience were othered in all of these very specific ways. And I think that made for the viewing experience to be really powerful, and maybe why I connected so strongly, because of the fact of what you're saying, that we had to go dig into a culture that, for those of us that are not Korean, that culture very much other than our own, both in terms of language, in terms of custom, tradition, as well as in terms of history. Because I feel like a lot of Americans are not familiar at all with the Korean War. And so all of that together made for this to be a pretty educational journey, starting with the kumiho and how that connects to Korean culture overall. So in case you missed it, Gia is a kumiho. And basically what a kumiho is in Korean lore, folklore, in terms of their monster history, it's a 9-tailed fox spirit. And this fox spirit is known to possess women, basically, so that they can devour boys.
And we've had some comments in Twitch and also on our Discord, which is shatontv.com/Discord if you want to join in, about how this mirrors a spirit or an entity in Chinese and Japanese folklore as well. Absolutely true. So there are versions of these beings in several Asian cultures, but the Korean one, as we saw, is by far the most gruesome.
And she is pretty gruesome. So let's talk about the timeline of what we find out about how Gia becomes a kumiho. So basically, her mother had her out of wedlock. So she has this daughter out of wedlock and is shunned because of that. So Gia's mother marries basically the first man that's able to take her on and willing to absorb that shame, willing to take on this daughter that was born out of wedlock, raise her as his own, and come in and save Gia's mother and in turn, supposedly Gia. But it doesn't quite, unfortunately, work out that way. It turns out that her stepfather is a pedophile. He rapes Gia repeatedly. It's insinuated beginning once she's very young, and then for many years afterward. It's implied that this goes on pretty much until her own sexual maturity. Her mother basically gets fed up and goes to a sorcerer or a witch doctor, or here, what's called a shaman, to summon the spirit of the kumiho to kill the pedophilic husband and stepdad. Unfortunately, like all good curses, though, there is an unintended consequence, which is that in order for Gia to turn human again and this fox-tailed spirit of the kumiho to leave her, she doesn't just have to kill her rapist. She has to absorb 100 souls in order to become human again.
And Lovecraft Country is doing a really smart thing here, Ash, in taking ancient folklore and once again, like it's done in previous episodes, applying these monster tales to more modern issues. And in this case, it's making a statement, I think, about how you don't have to be sexist, and I'm saying that in air quotes, or be racist to be part of a sexist or racist system. In this case, both Uma, Gia's mother, Atticus, all these people are involved in systems that are reinforcing sexism and racism, but also victims of it at the same time, right? So in this case, these Korean women, they're victims of two types of oppression, right? But it's being reinforced by the system that they're in. They're both women and Korean, and both of those are working against them.
For sure. And I think the kumiho is an interesting way to find justice as a woman, especially the way that it is depicted here, that she uses her womanhood, that she uses literally her sexual prowess in order to consume and devour these men, starting with the person that makes her an incredible victim, which is her rapist in terms of her stepdad. But not all kumihos look like this. They don't all have 9 foxtails that come out of the 9 orifices in their body. It depends on what source material you're looking at. So throughout Korean literature, kumehos are depicted in many different ways depending on what author you're reading. For those of us here in the States, think vampires. Think about how different an Anne Rice vampire versus a Joss Whedon vampire versus a 30 Days of Night graphic novel vampire. They're all different. They share the same characteristics of being undead and needing blood to survive, but it's very different in terms of how they're turned and how they exist, depending on who you read. And the kumehos are very, very similar in that way.
Yeah, for instance, in some legends, they eat the hearts and livers of their victims. That's like a normal thing for one to do, as normal as that is. Whereas like Gia sucks out their souls with foxtail tentacle things. It's a different spin on an old tale.
Well, and I think a much cooler spin. Like, I'd much rather eat a soul than a liver, like any day. And I think that the kumeho that we have here, that Gia is doing, this introduces kind of this really complex idea of what this quote unquote monster is doing walking among us, because Gia doesn't just absorb their souls, she absorbs through their souls their human emotions and their human memories. And that means that the only human part of her that is left, that she makes very clear, are these human emotions and human memories from the men that she is killing. That is what her only connection to mankind and being human is. And I think that what is so interesting about that is that as little humanity as she has, and the fact that the only humanity that she has comes amidst so much violence and so much gore with how she obtains that humanity, there's this great irony here that she's this huge fan of one particular human, which is Judy Garland. And we get to see that throughout the episode. And in truth, I think what the showrunners are showing us is that you have to be a little human to appreciate Judy Garland in a Judy Garland film. And Gia as the kumeho truly does that. And so that's kind of the next thing that we want to talk about, is the overt use of Judy Garland in this episode. And I don't know about Eugene, but I'm a huge Judy Garland fan. I'm a big fan of her musicals from the 1930s and the 1940s. And apparently this 9 fox-tailed monster is also a big fan of these movies and Judy as well. So we get this beautiful opening number where Gia is sitting there and she's fantasizing about singing and performing the musical number that she's watching from Meet Me in St. Louis, the movie that's playing in the movie theater. And it's very reminiscent from episode 2, where we have Uncle George and Letty doing this dance, this very exaggerated, very old style musical dance to the Jeffersons song, to that theme song at the start of episode 2. There's this optimism, there's this charm, and Gia is kind of repeating those motions with that same sense of charm and optimism. And we see her here hallucinating the fantasy in the same way. And while Gia, I think, because she's the monster, knows the fantasy isn't real, unlike Uncle George and Letty, where they believed it was, I think we have to recognize the connection between the opening here in South Korea in the 40s and that opening in the 1950s in the household in Ardham with George and Letty.
Bingo. This is the parlance of the show. One of the things that Lovecraft Country expressly set out to do from the beginning was sort of be this genre bending show that plays by its own rules. And I think this is one of the rules that they've set up here, that these musical interludes, if you do see one, it's about forgetting. It's about being under a spell, or at the very least, it's about imagination. And seeing it in episode 2 prepared us to see it, more times in the series. And so this didn't feel at all out of place. And in fact, it felt very comfortable and familiar.
It did, and it's actually one of the first moments in this series where I've gone click, like these are episodes that connect, because so many of the episodes, they feel so disparate in the way that they're presented in the storylines, and this was finally a connection, and maybe this will be a trend. Maybe this is now beginning to connect back half of the season with what we've seen in the first half of the season. But back to Judy. So if you've not watched a lot of Judy Garland films, all of Judy Garland's movies, they're big, they're emotional, they have a lot of melodrama. And this is a creature, this kumiho in Gia, she is sitting there, and like we talked about, she's only human because of these human souls that she's fed on. And so it would make sense that she would seek out things to make her feel things in a big way. That if she's going to feel anything, she's got to go to a source where there's a lot being given to her. So there's a lot of melodrama. And so there's big happy or there's big sad, so that maybe she can feel a little bit of that human normalcy that she sucked out of these guys. And if you're looking for big emotions, Judy movies are a place to go for that, because they give you big emotions just in absolute droves. And then the other connection here too is that Meet Me in St. Louis, if you've never seen it before, it's a movie that's told through a series of seasons. So the characters go through all of these different seasons and we follow them throughout the story throughout these seasons. And this episode follows almost identically this narrative structure where we go from the winter to the fall to the spring throughout the course of the timeline we're covering in this episode.
I thought it was just an aesthetic choice. It's really great to see that this is kind of thematically following the film. It's really smart stuff.
I agree. And I think it works really in a powerful way because it's also showing her maturity as a monster and as this link to a human, that she becomes more human the longer she's with Tick. And then look at that. We move from the cold of winter to the warmth of spring when she's in love with him. And so all of it connects together the same way it does for the characters in this Judy movie. And then the other big piece is Jean and I are always on the lookout for what is the voiceover that is being represented in this episode of Lovecraft. And this week it is a voiceover from Judy Garland herself, very much in her later life. She was preparing to write an autobiography, and so she collected all of these recordings of herself, these conversations that she was having about her life and about the place she was in her life. And while Judy Garland was revered, the papers were not very kind to her the later in life she got. She had immense issues with substance abuse. She had some anger issues. Her life just wasn't as picture perfect as people thought it was. And so she was raked over the coals because of it. And so she is describing in this voiceover the anger she has with the papers and the way journalists are portraying her. And she very specifically says that the woman they talk about is not the woman that she is. She doesn't know who that woman is. And she's frustrated that that's the Judy being put out to the world because it's not the Judy that she knows and that she embodies and that she truly is at the end of the day.
And not that we're anywhere as big as Judy Garland, but Ash, I felt a lot of this. As podcasters, we're often told what we are, how we think, and even what we're worth. And really with social media, anybody who steps into that ring is exposed to that degree of judgment. And it's people from the outside who don't know you, passing judgment and evaluating you as an individual. It's one of the parts that I connected with most strongly in Lovecraft Country. Anytime I could find something that touches me on a personal level in a TV show, I greatly appreciate it.
I couldn't agree more. And there's this one piece of the voiceover here where she says, perhaps you don't understand what it's like to pick up a paper and read things about yourself that aren't true. Read loathsome things that have nothing to do with your life or you or your heart or your beliefs or your kindnesses. And obviously you and I are going to pick up on that with like doing podcasting, right? Because YouTube and emails, we get stuff in, reviews, we get stuff in where people say Ashley is insert here, Gene is insert something here, and we're not. Like, we are not really those people. And in truth, you guys don't know us listening to us. Like, this is our podcasting side of our personalities, not like who we innately are. And Judy Garland, of course, is showing her acting side and not who she truly is. But this also really applies to our characters we've seen in the first half, where obviously we've got our Black characters that are being cast as one thing in society, and then they're not. There's something totally more complex and different than that. But I also think it applies here to Gia herself as this kumiho, because her mother's saying, you have to get this 100th soul so that you can become human again. And the kumiho has found her own identity and said, well, I'm not a monster. Atticus is not a monster just because we've done these monstrous things. So you're telling me what I am rather than letting me shape my own narrative in explaining what I am. And at the end of the day, what is a monster? Is it a literal being like I am? Or is it somebody who tries to take the identity away from someone because they want them to be something other than what they just are? And I think that's a really beautiful idea here, which leads us to the final scene in this episode. They go to see this shaman, and basically the shaman tells Gia, your mortal concerns, they are useless. This woman here, she's not your mother because you weren't birthed by any human being. You're asking about Atticus. Who cares about Atticus? You're going to have 1,000-year-old memory if that's what you want. And that's just going to be a blip on the radar for you. But she keeps persisting and she keeps saying, okay, shaman, you're also telling me what I am. And I'm telling you that I'm not what you think I am, and I'm not what my mother thinks I am. I'm somewhere in between, and I love this human. I love this being and Tick. And so she asks again, is he going to die? And there's this great piece that I hope is a little bit of foreshadowing where the shaman says, you've only just begun to see death. And for me, I got super excited about that. I started going, oh, is she going to be human? Is humanity really the monster? Does she want to be human? What does that mean? Can she be a monster and be human? Who knows? Because this is Lovecraft Country. They're all great questions for future episodes, and I hope that she is in many more of the episodes to come.
I am 100% okay with devoting another episode. Listen, we got 4 left. We can have another episode devoted to Gia. She is a fantastic character. Ash, one of the areas of interest that surprised me this week is several listeners who we interacted with on Sunday night and who also wrote in were like, tell us more about the Korean War. And I was like, really? You guys want to know about that? I don't know if it's that pertinent to the story, but there it was. It was a hunger for an education. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes just to talk about it really quickly. I am by no means a military expert, but I did spend a lot of my high school and college years studying U.S. military conflicts in Southeast Asia and Asia in general. And the background on this conflict is that the Empire of Japan was in control of Korea from 1910 to 1945. Now, obviously, 1945 was a big year. The Japanese surrendered in World War II. And if you think about Germany after World War II, where it was split into East and West, this was kind of like the spoils of war, right? The communists or the Soviets, they took the Eastern side, and the United Nations or the US really took the Western side. Well, you can think of Korea a lot in that way. It passed out of Japanese control, and it was split into North Korea, which was controlled by communist nations or communist influence, and South Korea, which was controlled by the UN and pretty specifically the US. But unlike Europe, where the UN was vigilant against Soviet aggression, that's where they expected any sort of conflict to happen. The US didn't really expect anyone to make a play for South Korea. So there wasn't much of a game plan to protect it. So while all the focus was in Europe and on Germany, things were happening in the 40s in South Korea. When the North, backed by the Soviets and China, decided to attack, the US and the UN, they knew they had to respond because Korea played 2 really important roles. One is it was a UN foothold in Asia. Basically, that was where we could project power. And two is that losing it would leave Japan isolated in an entirely communist sphere. So Japan post-war basically became an extension of the United States, and we had to protect it at all costs. It would basically be sitting on itself out there. I'm not saying that I agree with this policy, by the way. If you're listening, I'm not like, yes, that's the slippery slope works, and we had to, of course. This is just a bit of history. Now, the problem here was that the U.S. ended the war with Japan in a very specific way, right? We dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When we saw the awesome power of those bombs, we thought this is the future of warfare. And so the U.S. went all in on a nuclear bomber fleet and stopped investing in conventional forces. So suddenly we have a conflict in our hands. The North invades the South. The U.S. is pretty much unprepared to go, and we have to mobilize very, very quickly with an actual conventional military force. So President Truman gives the okay. Congress coughs up several $billion, and we go to war. Now, the thing is, this war was particularly nasty. What we see in this episode is just how horrible it was for civilians. In fact, I would say that this episode was fairly sanitized compared to how bad it was really for civilians. Civilian death tolls were particularly high. North Korea, and we're seeing South Korea here, North Korea was mercilessly bombed. And basically most of the major cities in Korea were destroyed. The war ended in 1953 with an armistice, but officially there is no treaty. The war is technically still happening. It's just nobody's really killing each other. And you have this demilitarized zone in the middle that's sort of keeping the peace. But tensions are and always have been very high. Another interesting allusion in this episode is Atticus refers to his points, that he's able to cycle up because of his points. And this is a really important system in the Korean War. So the point system in the U.S. Army has been around for a while. It predates Korea. And if you've seen like shows like Band of Brothers, people built up points, and that's how they would cycle back to the States. And there were different systems for different wars. So in Korea, you would get 4 points for every month you served in close combat, 2 points for every month that you served basically in rear echelon duty, not in combat in Korea, and then 1 point for duty anywhere else in the East. And the Army initially was like, okay, you need 43 points. That would be essentially 11 months or a year straight, and then you could go back to the States if you're enlisted, like Atticus was. If you were an officer, it was 55 points. It's a substantial amount of time for Atticus to be there. And so that discussion that he has with Jia is very significant in the fact that he's been there for a while. She's telling him not to go home. Any soldier would be getting out of there if they could. So it's a big ask for him to stay home.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting the point that's made in the episode that he enlisted, that he wasn't drafted. And so, here he is, he's been there for such a lengthy time period, and it is a big ask, but he also doesn't have much to go back home to. We know that he's got this horrible relationship with his dad. We know that he's got a good relationship with Uncle George, but we also know that when he goes back, it's not like he goes back to Chicago immediately. He goes to Florida to do whatever he was doing there. And so I wonder for somebody like him, because there was a lot of men that stayed after the war, after all these conflicts, there's a lot of American soldiers who wind up staying. And I wonder if things wouldn't have been very different for him if he wouldn't have stayed, if she hadn't have gone all sucky tails coming out of her eyes type thing. If he would have stuck around with her, because for the guys that were drafted, I think they get the fuck out of Dodge as soon as they can. But for him, I do think it's important for us to remember that he chose to be there, and I don't know necessarily that he would have a whole lot of wish to just hop back on the next plane to the States.
Ash, that brings up a really interesting question too, because we see in this episode that Gia is able to see Atticus's future. It's a power that we weren't really aware of with her previous victims. Now it makes sense. Like, she saw what a guy's future would have been if she had not consumed his soul and pureed him all over the walls of her room. In Atticus's case, she sees his future, and I wonder if the show is telling us that there is a fatalistic view, that there is no escaping your fate, or this is the path that you are currently on and it can be changed. They don't really establish that. But that does bring us to what we learned about Atticus in this episode, and particularly through Gia's visions. And it starts with Atticus's childhood. As she has her foxtails in his orifices, we start to see Atticus's life kind of flash before her eyes and his eyes. And the events that are depicted while Gia is hitting Atticus with her sexual pipe cleaners start with Atticus's childhood. And there's not a lot of new information here. We see that he's a bookworm, kind of a nerdy kid. We see that his father abused him. None of that's really news, right? But things do get more disturbing as we get closer to present day. Now, Ash, these are open to interpretation, and this is simply how I saw it. In Gia's vision, it seems that we get confirmation that Atticus did torture Koreans or was involved in their torture, specifically by assisting in what appears to be the extraction of teeth. Honestly, his callous execution of a Korean civilian in real time, not in the vision, I felt that was far more disturbing. And I was shocked, frankly, that Gia ever accepted him after seeing that.
Well, I mean, she does explode men with foxtails and so I think her standards are a little bit different than ours, but there's also that great line where she looks at him and she says, just because we've done monstrous things doesn't make us a monster. And I really think that she views him and his past actions as equivalent with what she's done. She's only taken 99 souls. He may have taken a hell of a lot more than that. And so for her, I think she considers them equals in terms of their monstrousness and their capability toward violence. And I think maybe that's why she thinks that they're soulmates of sorts, because they both are so bleak in terms of the things that they've done to other humans, or to humans, since she's not human herself.
Yeah, it's why you and Tom get along.
Exactly. I mean, I explode men with foxtails that come out of 9 orifices, and he's pretty fucking dark too. So.
Well, while getting background on Atticus was useful, I think that Gia's ability to see his future kind of told us the most. First, like I mentioned earlier, the show seems to suggest a sort of fatalistic viewpoint that there is a terminus for Atticus that he is approaching. It's very Final Destination, right? But the other thing that we see is Atticus, from what I could tell, and I watched the scene like twice, and again, it's flashing by very fast, but it looks to me like he's involved with some other woman after he gets back to the United States, but before he goes to Chicago. So I'm guessing like while he's in Florida, like his normal life when he gets back. That wasn't anybody we'd seen before, right? It's a totally different person.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like he's having sex with her, and it is clearly not anybody we've met yet.
Also, Atticus, very picky about his partners. He's like 10's only for Atticus. And I mean, look at him. Come on.
I would say he's pretty close to being a 10 himself, so makes sense.
Well, in the next part of the vision, so he gets on the bus, he goes to Chicago. And again, this is assuming that all this is chronological. We see Letty's face, which seems to be at a point in time beyond anything we've seen in the first 5 episodes of Lovecraft Country. I don't remember her looking this way in any scene that we've seen. Then we see Atticus being baptized. And then later we see him like strapped to a wall or some sort of a post or something like that. I'm guessing this doesn't all happen at the same time. It looks like we're flashing forward like several months, if not years, in between these scenes.
Yeah, I read a really funny review that was like, could her vision not be more specific? Like Atticus should avoid things that have black straps just in the near future, and I agree, because it's not really clear what it is that he has it. And she didn't flash to him, being trapped in some sort of like Tesla experimental Garden of Eden doorway, house burning down, led by a ghost scenario. Like this is what she flashed to. But I do think it gives us clues to look for in the future and gives us things to go, oh shit, like this is when the big stuff is happening. This is when the DIE may be, rounding the corner here, and time may be running out for Tick.
Yeah, and Gia, at this point in the vision, she warns Atticus that if he goes home, he will die. if we get to that scene, guys, it's probably bad news for Atticus. Although, honestly, I didn't need a vision to tell me that. Generally, if your protagonist is strapped to some sort of a contraption and looks like he's in pain, things are not hunky-dory. But beyond the supernatural, beyond these visions, I think we learned a few other things about Atticus. And most specifically, the one thing I wanted to focus on is about his emotional maturity and also his need for affection. We saw hints of this with Letty in earlier episodes, but I think this episode really confirms some things about Atticus. He is a virgin, and he seems very, very desperate for affection and approval. And this makes sense, right? If you think about his upbringing, think about his childhood, not a lot of love in the home. I'm assuming that things between Montrose and his mother weren't super great. Montrose himself was abusive toward Atticus and is a bit closed off as an individual, and with good reason. And so I think that what we're seeing here is not only Atticus's desire for adventure in losing himself in books and losing himself in military service, but we're also seeing that he needs another person, and he turns almost boyish when he goes into the room with Gia, right? And it kind of flips things on its head, where she is this being who has consumed 99 souls, and in doing so, the lives of 99 people, right? So she is aged well beyond her years and very worldly and very aware, whereas Atticus is basically a baby in all this.
I agree. I mean, I was very surprised to hear that he was a virgin there. Not that there's anything wrong with being a virgin, but he comes across as being somebody that is very assured of himself because of all types of experiences, and like seeing the lacking of experience that he has in a very common area that a man like him maybe would have more experience in was just interesting. And it also shows how sweet he is, like the whole setting up, the movie theater. I think it just shows that he's just a really good guy and a very complex guy, as we all are. I mean, obviously, I hope nobody out there, is torturing people, but I think we all have darkness in us and we all have light in us. And I think that we got to see that about Atticus, that he's somebody that is very complicated and has this dichotomy about his personality that maybe makes a bit more sense why he's been so hardened, and I have outright called unlikable at times on this show. It helps us understand maybe a bit of why he is like that now, 5, 6, 7 years later than the events that we're seeing in this episode.
And that brings us to our email and voicemail for the week. Now, if you don't hear your email or voicemail on this episode, remember we do have our Shappy Hour on Fridays. That is at 9 p.m. Eastern, and we do play voicemail, we do read email, and we do respond to some additional thoughts on Lovecraft Country later in the week. So please join us there. And if you miss it, you can catch it on YouTube at shatontv.com/YouTube.
So our first email comes from Raymond from Atlanta, and it's entitled "A God Walks in Daegu." After watching last night's episode, it struck me that there were certain similarities between episode 8 of Watchmen. Both were slower paced backstories and took place in and took place in an Asian country in a war-torn Asian country. Okay. And took place in a war-torn Asian country. I think these episodes work as a pressure release valve that are needed when shows move so fast and have complex stories. But at the same time, I don't think a 10-episode season could afford a lot of these types of episodes because it would disrupt the flow of the whole series. This might be my favorite episode this season. Raymond from Atlanta.
So Raymond writes in and calls in often, and we really, really appreciate that. And before responding to his email, I wanted to take a second and say congratulations to Watchmen, which we did cover, by the way, guys.
Yes.
Shat on TV did cover. So if you haven't checked it out already, go check it out. Watch the series. It is well worth watching, and do listen to the podcast. Just this week, Watchmen won Emmys for lead actress in a limited series in Regina King, supporting actor in a limited series with Yahya Abdul-Mateen II, and best limited series. So we knew when we were watching it, it was a quality program, and it's nice to see it get the recognition it deserves.
Absolutely. And I'll say I also got very similar vibes in this episode. I enjoyed the backstory episode of Watchmen that Raymond is referring to here, just like I enjoyed the episode of Westworld that I mentioned. I think I'm just a sucker for these one offs. I like the change up, but I do think that Raymond has a good point. I think maybe why it stands out more in Lovecraft is this season already is telling so many different stories, and it already is kind of jumping all over the place in a way that has turned a lot of the audience off, that maybe going back in time 7 years and going to another country and introducing all new characters, maybe that wasn't the best use of their time, but I'm kind of just personally super glad that they did it because I liked it so much. All right, up next, we have one from our good friend Susan from State College, and it is entitled Uma and Montrose. Gia was illegitimate. Tick might be George's son. Both were abused by their supposed fathers. Both have a connection to magic. Both have seen and done terrible things in order to fulfill their duties. Tick's duty to the military and Gia's duty to her mother. Gia's mother strikes a Faustian bargain to protect her daughter and agrees to another price to pay at the end of the episode to help Gia again. Montrose also wants to protect Tick, and his idea of protecting Tick is almost as destructive as Gia's mother's response. Montrose and Gia's mother were also trying to hide their own otherness, Montrose being gay and the mother having a child out of wedlock. And both use marriage as a cover to protect themselves and inadvertently cause more pain to their respective families. The shaman's prediction at the end was more than ominous, which means we probably haven't seen the last of the nine-tailed fox. Take care, Susan from State College.
I love that the audience is putting together all of these parallels that, frankly, I didn't catch all of them. Like, I recognized that there was a similarity in characters, but Susan, you did a great job really cataloging all the ways that these parents are similar. And not to pat myself on the back, but looking back to my idea in the last deep dive about these legacies, I think that plays very nicely into that motif. We're seeing layers develop in this series that I was not expecting, and I'm here for it.
All right, the next one comes from Jody George, and it's entitled Sex in Strange Case. Hey, crew. A very different challenge I faced was the love scene for Montrose. Parts were aggressive, and I noticed myself wincing. This made me self-reflect on why. I compared it to the scene between Tick and Letty. There was no difference sexually in the scenes, besides the equipment ratio of the participants. I have not been exposed in movies and TV to raw, consensual homosexual sex for the most part. I found myself in a metamorphosis of my own during the 30 seconds or whatever it was of the scene, from wincing to self-reflection to being thankful the scene was here. Lastly, the scene on societal social tourism that you commented on. The white people's trip to the South Side was portrayed very well, I thought. The tourist inappropriate actions were insufferable and immediately apparent. They were treating it with no respect, and it is so clear that this is a privilege not afforded to the Black population. Jean's comments about being angry when people cross those barriers, well tempered by Ashley, were challenging for me. Getting to the root of why people are crossing barriers is not always clear. I've been to a couple drag shows, for example, to seek understanding and show respect to that group. I wanted to gain knowledge and understanding, as Ashley put it. In my opinion, I don't think this was something to be discouraged, unless, of course, the group doesn't want me there, which I would clearly respect. My wife is Polynesian and was born and raised in Hawaii, so she has a clear understanding of cultural appropriation and this kind of tourism. People attending a luau put on by the Sheridan is borderline offensive to her. Even more authentic luau's or hula performances are treated as a gag or a circus show by some people. Many, though, come into these experiences with open hearts to seek knowledge and understanding of the deep cultural significance of these events. The best way to do that, in my opinion, is to attend. Again, great job with the pod. I listened to most of the Shat available and look forward to my commission next year. Thank you, Jody George. So first of all, I love the fact that someone finally noticed that I temper you, Jean.
Yes.
And you're welcome to both you and the audience. But that aside, I totally agree with you here, Judy. First of all, I love your honesty. I think that we aren't exposed to homosexual sex on screen the same way we are to heterosexual sex. And even this scene, a lot of people wrote about it and they're like, okay, we got the Brokeback sex scene, right? 1, no lube. Check. 2, no kissing. Check. 3, like, they went down. And it's like, unfortunately, like that isn't what all homosexual sex looks like, right? Like it isn't all like this. And I think the more we see homosexual sex scenes and the more we're exposed to the different ways that people that are not heterosexual have sex, I think it's a really positive thing. And then finally, to your points about Hawaii, when my husband and I have been there, we don't go to the luau's for the very reason that you're talking about here. We don't see it as some tourist attraction that we're just kind of passing through. In the same way, I mentioned like the Mardi Gras Indians previously. Like there's parts of Mardi Gras that I don't believe that tourists, even me being from New Orleans, I don't believe there's things that I have a right to participate in, much less tourists. And so I appreciate you bringing yet another example to another anecdote to what we're talking about here about what social tourism can look like and how destructive it can be.
And if I can add anything to that, Ash, it would be the term acting a fool. It's okay to go to stuff. Don't act a fool.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about, people. Don't act a fool.
And don't try to make it your own. Like, don't go and then go buy yourself a hula skirt and a coconut bra and then go home and be like, I learned the hula in Hawaii. Like, no.
Yeah, save that for Shappy Hour.
Right, exactly. All right, and then our final email comes from Brianna J, and it is entitled, Letty and Ruby Are Not Out of Place in Time. Hi, everyone. I stumbled upon your podcast as I gleefully fell down the rabbit hole of this amazing TV show, and man, am I glad I did. Ash, your ability to approach the light and heavy topics in this series makes me proud to be a fellow teacher and educator. You represent our guild exquisitely. Now down to the reason I'm emailing y'all. It's been said a few times that Letty and Ruby feel out of place in the time setting of the show because they are headstrong, outspoken, not scared to cuss, and stand their ground. And as a daughter, granddaughter, and niece of Black women who lived through the 50s, all that attitude is 100% accurate for that time period. My female family members were radically living out loud back then and knew plenty of other Black women who lived the same. Due to respectability, politics that existed then and still in some ways now, many people outside of our community don't always see the badass bitch, as Ash says, side of Black women. They see it exploited on TV and film as the sassy Black woman in a white space trope. But not often do non-Black people witness the atypical dynamics of gender roles that exist in the Black community. There's a whole history of non-typical gender roles in Black communities that's tied to family structures being torn apart during slavery, and how because of the absence of Black men in those family structures due to being sold away to other plantations, Black women often found themselves having to find their footing in the feminine and masculine areas of the gender spectrum. But that's a whole other conversation. Ultimately, the way the women in the show are acting is not a 2020 perspective the showrunner and writers are projecting back onto this time period. Black women have been that spicy for a long time, and it is nice to see that aspect of us shown in a way that's not always used as a punchline. Love the show, love the conversation. Keep on shatting on these hoes. Be safe. Brianna J.
So 2 things here. One, Brianna, I apologize for making assumptions, right? I was applying mainstream white culture in which I was raised to other cultures in which I was not raised. And so I was saying, wow, no woman in the 50s acted like that. Well, wrong, Gene. Actually, people did. You just A, weren't alive for it, and B, weren't a part of that culture to see the kind of inner workings. And the second part to my response is there is a dreadful irony to me making this assumption because I was raised in a Iranian and Kurdish family. In that upbringing, people think of Middle Eastern women as subdued, and they're always have their faces covered, and they're very subservient to men. Nope, wrong. Like, if you look at my mom, you look at my aunts, they are wild. They're so outspoken, so opinionated, and women really run the household when you are in Iranian and Kurdish inner workings, right? When you get really down to the family there. And again, yeah, my mom and my aunts say shit that shocks me at times. And so it's mildly embarrassing that I completely struck out on that one. But I appreciate you writing in and correcting me.
And I also appreciate an educator writing into this show. So thank you so much. I hope that you're surviving educating in this crazy ass time that we are living in. And I appreciate the kind words. We've not been getting many kind words lately. So Brianna, you made my entire week. So thank you.
And thanks to everyone who wrote in. Again, if you'd like to write into the podcast, it's hosts@shatontv.com. We'd love to hear from you. And we have one voicemail this week that came in from Dominique. Well, we had another one from Flavor Day, but we're going to save that for Shappy Hour. So we have one voicemail that came in, and it's from Dominique.
Hi, y'all. It's Dominique. I just finished listening to your podcast review of Lovecraft Episode 5, and I really just wanted to kind of piggyback on an idea that Black Nerd, I believe it was, left in an email. And basically they were saying that, they were concerned about Tamara's character and the character development or lack thereof. And I've been hearing a few things. Some people felt that way about Uncle George. And, there's been some arguments about how can we argue for Yahima and respect for this two-spirit person and their portrayal, but not the other Black characters. And I just wanted to interject as a Black woman. It's a predominantly Black show, and it is doing a pretty good job of presenting us with an ensemble cast. And particularly when it comes to a character like Tamara, who is at least seems to be a cis woman, there are other Black women in the show who are being developed, and they're not all the same. They're not a monolith. We have Hippolyta, we have Ruby, we have Letitia, and we also have Diana, who seems to have a story that might be coming of her own, or at least something that coincides with Hippolyta's story. And I just feel like when Black shows happen, are successful, we put a lot of pressure on them to represent everyone and everything. And while I think the Yahima conversation is necessary, and I definitely think that's something to bring to the writer's room and really kind of challenge them with, I don't think that the side characters or the characters who kind of are in the story, like, just in the peripheral of the story, I don't think they're them being sacrificed or plot devices or whatever we use in the storytelling. I don't think that's detrimental to the story. I don't think it's disrespectful, because we have so much representation, and I think there's so much space in what's being done. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Maybe it was a bit of a ramble, but I just felt really passionately about the pressure that we put on Black shows to represent everyone all the time, and how it sometimes invalidates the real conversations about representation, i.e. Yahima. Thanks.
Ash, when we covered episode 5 of Lovecraft Country, there were a lot of people writing in, and we noticed it as well, pointing out the parallels between like National Treasure or Indiana Jones, movies that we'd seen before that kind of had that adventure spirit. I even mentioned, the Goonies. If you could imagine us applying the amount of pressure and the demand for careful consideration and sensitivity to cultural differences, to identity differences, to those films, Dominique's absolutely right. It is a very high bar that's being set. Now, it might be a consequence of the times, and we're in 2020. Those films were made earlier, but you and I do Shat the movies. We put a movie out every week, and it's watching 80s and 90s movies. We could eat up an entire hour just talking about how culturally insensitive or sexually insensitive or just overall offensive some of the movies are that we watch, but we let it go. And I think it's because we kind of have learned to expect from an 80s or 90s movie usually directed by a white person and starring usually a mostly white cast telling a mostly white story. And guys, this is not white hate. This is just facts. But we do have a different standard there. And so, I think Dominique is absolutely right. And it doesn't have to be an either or thing, in the sense that it is perfectly okay to say, I don't feel that this character was treated fairly. And I feel that people whose sexuality is not necessarily defined or differs from the mainstream, or gender differs from the mainstream, saying that I don't feel they're getting a fair shake, or I feel like this character is being abused in this story, that's okay. And at the same time, it's okay to say, listen, I think the show did its best. Right? They really tried to show representation. Sometimes experiments fail, guys. And I agree with Dominique that it is asking a lot for a show to have so many conversations at once and hit the nail on the head every single time.
I don't disagree, but you don't have to make her a two-spirit then, right? Like, that wasn't necessary. So I think that we should require more of our television, all television, not just Lovecraft Country. We should require more of every show. And so if we know for a fact that a certain group is brutalized in a multitude of ways, then perhaps if we don't have the time to pay that story its due and to ensure true and equal and fair representation of that particular storyline, then choose a different storyline. I think that that's the answer to that. And I had somebody private message me and ask me about the show Pose, because Pose is a great show on FX if you've not watched it, about ball culture, and that is a large portion of the cast is trans, playing trans characters, which is a really beautiful thing. And in that show, there is a brutalization of a trans character, but they're like, well, did that offend you too? And it's like, well, no, because that storyline has a purpose. They're showing that this is what happens to this population and exploring the consequences of that. And they give this beautiful send off to that character as well through the ball culture. And so it's done in a way that they chose to say, okay, this person is trans and this person is going to be brutalized, and this is why we're choosing to do that, and spent 2 whole episodes on it, right? Clearly Lovecraft can't do that. Yahima isn't important enough to the story narratively, whether she's trans, two-spirit or not. She isn't important enough to spend 2 episodes on. I understand that. So my answer then would be, okay, fine, that's okay. Nothing in there said that she had to be that, though, right? Like, if they couldn't spend the time on it, I would just suggest maybe choosing a different representation for the sake of representation. If you're not going to take the time to do it correctly, doesn't work. It backfires, right? You're talking about the experiment. That's when the experiment fails, is when we're doing things haphazardly to just get everything in there, like check, 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 check. And that's when the experiment fails, in my opinion, at least.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ash Schlafly.
It sounds so ominous. You've yet to see death.
Well, thank you everyone who wrote in and called in. That concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Lovecraft Country. We hope you enjoyed and will join us next week for more. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcasts. The website is shatontv.com. Again, you can email us, hosts@shatontv.com, any time of week. We've had some people ask us, what's the deadline for emails? It's never. You can write us anytime. We'll fit it into some episode, or we'll at least write you back. You can also call us at 914-719-SHAT, leave a voicemail, especially if your name is Tawana or Flavor Dave. You can catch us on Twitch at shatontv.com/Twitch. As a reminder, Wednesday nights, Friday nights, and Sunday nights are the best times to join us. Wednesday nights for Getting By with the King Bee, where we play video games with the King Bee. Friday nights for Shappy Hour Cocktail Party at 9 p.m. You don't have to have a cocktail. That part's optional. You do have to attend. And of course, Sunday nights for Lovecraft Live, where we provide our instant reactions and hear from you, the audience, immediately after the episode of Lovecraft Country. Also, be sure to check out our sister podcast, Shat the Movies, where we join our good friend Big D, Dick Ebert, to cover 80s and 90s movies commissioned by you, the listeners. Big D just put out Fast Times at Ridgemont High. And if you started out and you're not super impressed with it, go to like the 21-minute mark and shit gets crazy. We got discussions of blowjobs. We got discussions of the mysteries of the whispering eye. We've got discussions of Big D discovering that life is hard for women. There's lots to learn from our Fast Times at Ridgemont High episode, so do check that out. And all of our past films at shatthemovies.com, wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please be sure to leave a 5-star review and very nice things about me and Ash. That helps the podcast grow. On behalf of my co-hosts, Ashley Schlafly, the King Bee, and Big D, Dick Ebert, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us on Sunday night for Lovecraft Live, covering episode 7 of Lovecraft Country. I am. Thanks for listening. Remember to be safe, wear a mask, and register to vote.
And stay the fuck at home.